We had lots of conversations with people, didn't we, around the edges of with New Eyes I See. Somebody said, and I loved this quote, that they really liked it because it wasn't yawny, like a kind of typical museum experience. And I do think, people, it's almost like a fetishization of this kind of idea of a museum, and we see it a lot in research. But as you say, very often when you go to museums now, you're having all sorts of different kinds of experiences. But if you ask somebody what a museum is, they'll tell you it's yawny and it's full of glass cases. And so, there's still that kind of perception, for sure.
And just a question on that. Do you think that's because of digital, in the sense of, so there's archival material that has been in an archive, in a dusty archive, not really viewed before. Someone's probably thought the story isn't good enough, or there's not enough kind of it. And then you've got this digital element that kind of allows you to glue things together to create something that's a bit bigger. So you've kind of got this element of, you could argue, democratizing the ability to share stories that were tiny and make, and bring light to them. But then equally, it sounds like there's other opportunities, like you say, the experiences in museums have kind of altered to be more experience-based rather than something in a glass box with a little plaque and that's the end of your kind of thing. And there's your assumption is that there's lots of stuff in the glass that's the same because they're in the same box, but beyond that you have nothing. And so I wondered if the digital gives you that affordance of story or background, but also maybe allows you to share new stories that were maybe untold.
So I think digital is a part of that and has really helped to kind of, open up the work of these institutions. But I think they have also been on a bit of a journey anyway in becoming more kind of, visitor-centred, audience-centred in probably since the kind of, even the 80s and 90s. So there was this kind of, this is me getting into the theoretical bit now.
I love this.
Kind of the new museology movement from kind of like the 80s and 90s, right, which was about trying to kind of open up the stories that institutions tell and to try and, represent previously underrepresented or, not, groups that just invisible groups, and silenced groups as well, and to try and diversify the stories that museums engage with. So I think digital has been a kind of part of that. It's been an important part of that, especially in recent years. But actually, I've even found myself reflecting more recently that some of the digital work that museums do can also squash down or flatten those opportunities as well. And that museums can be quite worried about what they're doing in the digital environment, especially in the environment of social media. So some do really nice, super creative, very kind of impactful work within social networks. But others really struggle with that. And, and you might find if you walked into those museums, you would have a whole bunch and range of encounters that are much more kind of open and much more storified and experiential and performative than the kinds of things you would do in their digital environment. So I think it's a complex picture really.
You've got an organisation or organisations that effectively have been asked to collect things and say things about things that have happened. And then you've got this digital affordance that allows instantaneous commentary and creation. And suddenly they've just like, okay, everything you kind of have done, like considered, whether it's kind of however their opinions kind of laid out, and then suddenly now kind of be open and create almost, feels almost like quite a radical change for them. And I can see why it takes so long.
Yeah, because I guess historically you're limited by the numbers of walls that you have or physical space that you have in a museum to display things within the archive.
Yeah.
Whereas I suppose digital really opens up that canvas, and it comes back down to how do our cultural institutions curate things. And I know that's quite as you said, a much broader, bigger discussion now that is more within the public realm about how do those institutions reflect all of our society in all its
it's
beautiful,
quite a political conversation then as well, isn't it?
Beautiful and ugly facets,
wars,
isn't it? You know, all of that.
Even that is very zeitgeisty or very of the time, you know. So in 10 years' time, I'm sure the conversations will be altered and things like that. Yeah, it's just kind of interesting, I guess, going back to when you were talking about the first times you kind of involved digital and whether people saw value in digital up front, you know, like when did that change? And I think we kind of always think about maybe like the iPhone being that moment where, you know, without the iPhone, a lot of things don't happen. Like Twitter doesn't exist really, Instagram doesn't exist, you know, those kind of things. So it's almost like when did digital become a thing within these organizations? When did it become and then equally, when was it a thing to collect data? When was it a thing to create experiences from? And then when was it a thing to then almost market? You know, all those three things are kind of like tension against each other, I guess. It's just kind of interesting to see how that is. And I guess we'll maybe discuss it in a moment. One of the really interesting things is museums like the video game museum that was in Nottingham. I think it's just moved to Sheffield. Like we're making all this stuff, but it's just disappearing. You know, like you cannot play a computer game from the 1990s unless you go to a museum to play it. So you can, if everything's culturally digital, and then where do you go to experience what happened? And then is there a past in that context? It's quite interesting.
There's been a big discussion about how museums, archives should think about born digital outputs. So, you know, how do you collect a meme? You know, what happens with social networks, all the rest of it. And that's interesting and really important, but it also kind of does really hammer home or, you know, I think overemphasize the kind of intangible quality of, you know, of digital stuff. And I think increasingly we are starting to think more about actually the kind of material realities of, you know, of digital bits and bobs. All of the kind of detritus that kind of, you know, sits in the cloud and has an environmental impact, and all of the old hardware that just kind of, you know, clutters up the place. So I think it's really helpful and productive, and I do this a lot with the students to think about the kind of material story of, you know, digital stuff. And you know, does that maybe help museums think about how to, you know, handle this stuff going forward? Maybe. And that's been a big feature of the work that we've done, is thinking across the kind of, you know, digital, physical, thinking about the materiality of, you know, digital interactions. And I think especially with traces was something that we were able to think about quite carefully and productively. And the reflections were lovely. And I think we wrote a paper about those as well. And and people talked very openly about how emotional they'd become at parts during the experience, and then they were able to kind of, you know, track that to their kind of, you know, understanding of what was going on. So their understanding of Cyril and his life and the kind of gravity of war, but also I think people reflected a lot on that kind of fragmented nature of, you know, history and museum making, and you know, kind of opening up the idea of what a museum is, which, you know, was really intriguing for us, and certainly for me in terms of the research that I do. And I think one of my favourite kind of reflections that came through in those discussions was where people were talking about the ways in which, so the kind of significance of place, but the way that they'd kind of scripted in other things that were happening within that space into the narrative. And again, I think that informed maybe what we did a bit with Traces, but they would talk about things like the smell of the flowers, and they would talk about the, you know, the noise of a helicopter, and they would kind of, you know, script that into the story somehow, which was really powerful, and something I don't think we had anticipated. Well, maybe you would have understood that potential better, having done the street gaming previously. But for me, that was quite kind of, profound in terms of thinking about how you could, use a space to tell a story, but how you couldn't control, the space, but that could be quite kind of a productive thing as well. That was really quite a kind of exciting realization. So I think that the whole thing about place came through really powerfully in those discussions, and absolutely that sense that we had kind of disrupted here a kind of museum norm that people were used to expecting and articulating.